Podcast Junkies, episode 364. Welcome back. I'm your host, Harry Duran. If you're new to the show, it's the one where we search out interesting voices in podcasting, get them to kick back their heels and talk about their shows and whatever else is on their mind. In case you missed last week's show, we had a great conversation with Eitan Ben-Susan. He's the host of This Week in Small Business and the CEO of North One, which is the online bank that I use. I happened to reach out to Eitan and I saw that he had a show. And I said, hey, would you like to be on? And he graciously agreed. And we had a fantastic conversation. He shared his path from a science student to fintech investor. And with a background in management consulting and a family history of small business ownership, he brings a unique perspective to the world of business banking. He revealed how North One was born from a desire to solve the financial pain points of small business owners. And he discusses the importance of rigorous thinking, resilience in the face of challenges, and the power of customer-driven innovation. The conversation also touched on Eitan's experiences as a podcast host, the power of empathy and leadership, and the constant drive to improve and anticipate customers' needs. Eitan's insights offer a masterclass in entrepreneurship and the evolution of financial tech. We had a really great conversation, really engaging, and I think you'll get a lot out of it. So please check that out if you haven't done so already. This week, another fantastic conversation with April Adams Pertuis. She's the host of the Inside Story podcast and the founder of Light Beamers. Fantastic name, by the way, and you'll understand why later on in this episode. She shared her journey from broadcast journalism to becoming a storytelling coach, highlighting how her experiences shaped her passion for helping others share their stories. We discussed the power of storytelling, the challenges of starting a podcast, and the importance of being present and compassionate when interviewing others, something that's near and dear to my heart. April's insights on overcoming self-doubt and the transformative nature of storytelling are truly inspiring, and her approach to interviewing, which she developed over thousands of conversations, offer valuable lessons for podcasters and storytellers alike. I particularly enjoyed our discussion about the evolution of her podcast and how it has become a platform for her to practice vulnerability and authenticity. This conversation left me feeling energized and reminded me of the profound impact our stories can have on others. As I've been doing lately, I like to highlight 5 key takeaways that I want you to listen and look for in this upcoming conversation. Number 1, embrace your story no matter how big or how small. Whether you have a complex, messy narrative or feel your life is vanilla, your experiences are valuable and worth sharing. 2, focus on the transformation in your story. Move past dwelling on the before and highlight how you've grown, what you've learned, and who you've become. 3, she talks about using heart math to connect with interviewees. Enter conversations with genuine openness, compassion, and a desire to listen without judgment. This creates a safe space for authentic sharing. 4, practice telling your story. Even if you're used to sharing other stories, push yourself to be vulnerable and share your experiences. This builds authenticity and connection with your audience. And 5, surround yourself with people who challenge you. Seek out relationships that push you to grow, call out your potential, and refuse to let you play small. This environment fosters continuous personal and professional development. If you're enjoying this episode, specifically here on YouTube, please make sure to click the subscribe button so you'll be notified when new episodes go live and help us to increase viewership on this platform. And thank you for doing so. And if you're feeling extra generous, you can always go to podcastjunkies.com/love to leave me a rating and a review. I'd love to read yours out and maybe here on YouTube on the video out next on our future episode. And thank you in advance for doing that. Okay, enough about me. Let's get into this fantastic conversation with April. So April Adams Pertuis, host of the Inside Story podcast. Thank you so much for joining me on Podcast Junkies.
Thank you, Harry. So happy to be here.
I'm always grateful for the different ways I get to connect and meet new podcasters. It feels I picked a topic area that I guess I'll never run out of content and I'll never run out of people to speak to.
Yeah, your well is very deep. That's for sure.
Yeah. So we connected on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, is that a platform that you use normally? How do you make new connections, or what's your networking look like lately?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, LinkedIn has been one of those interesting platforms that I literally got on. I mean, when did LinkedIn come out? Like, early 2000s, maybe even before that. And I got on it because someone said, oh, this was when social media wasn't even social media. And so get on this thing. This is how you're going to be able to network and connect with people. And I remember at the time going, huh? Okay. I signed up and I built a profile. This was, so long ago that my business and my life looks very different now. And then it just sat there for all those years. And it really wasn't until even I've had my business now 10 years, but I don't really think I started paying attention to LinkedIn until maybe, honestly, like 3-4 years ago.
Yeah,
And
same, I
even
think.
now,
Yeah.
it's still a work in progress because I am enjoying it more and more and more that I'm over there. Case in point, getting to meet people like you, and I've met some other really cool podcasters and people that I've been able to connect with and have great conversations with. And I'm like, I should spend more time on LinkedIn because it is very fruitful. For the vast majority of the last 10 years, I just built on Facebook because it's where I already was, is just like connecting with friends from college and doing all of that. But then when
Yeah.
I really started to learn how to use social media in a really strategic way, Facebook was first and natural for me. And I have a community there. So I spend a lot of time on Facebook. But LinkedIn really has been kind of like a really sweet surprise. And it's funny because I've had it all these years. I think about, man, what kind of
Yeah.
LinkedIn guru could I be by now if I had listened to those people, back at that seminar that I went to all those years ago. But, timing is always exactly as it's supposed to be. And I'm there now. So,
I think what happens is I was in corporate for 20 plus years, and you only think of it as like, I got to refresh it when I'm changing a
good
job. And people
job.
always, and they only
Yeah.
do it when they get fired or they get laid off. They're just like, okay,
Right.
dust off my
And it's just
online
changed so much.
resume.
It's no
Oh,
longer
for
really
sure.
that platform. So it's really
No,
interesting. Yeah.
there's probably more than that, but there's the two distinct worlds, like the 9 to 5ers who
Yeah.
like that's their role. And then the people who are entrepreneurs and have started to realize like the power in connecting
Oh, yeah.
with people that are in your space. And so
Yeah.
I think what's interesting is I'm surprised sometimes, and I see most podcasters or some that I speak to don't even put their podcast details on LinkedIn. And I was like, it's such a great platform. Like one of the first things I did is when I started the 2 shows that I host, I put host as a job title. And I was like, that's one of the job titles. And the funny part about the algorithm is it like notifies people like Harry just celebrated like 10 years of Podcast Junkies, and then
Yeah,
I'll get all
yeah,
these messages. But it's a like nice little like, micro marketing for your show kind of way, because it's an opportunity for me to just let people know like, oh yeah, it's been start
yeah.
conversations about the show.
Man, I'm gonna have to go check my LinkedIn profile and see if I even have mine set up like that. That's a really good point, because
Yeah,
and that's the beauty of these conversations. We're always learning best practices from each
sure.
other and thinking about, oh, I hadn't thought about that.
So you mentioned roughly about 4 years with the show.
Yeah, it's been 4 years, I would
Okay,
say. Yeah.
we'll get into the origin story. But if you had to look back at those 4 years, and I always say like for me starting the podcast was probably transformational because I own a podcast agency now. It's like I eat, sleep, and breathe podcasting, and it was like one of the best decisions I ever made. So can you point to something that's like a big win, or this would not have happened had it not been for my podcast?
Honestly, I know that the easy answer is like, "Oh, I landed this great client," or "I got this cool
Yeah,
opportunity."
yeah.
And yeah, those things have happened, but those honestly aren't my biggest wins. To be honest, my biggest win is that I have stuck with this for 4 years weekly, producing weekly, a show every single week. I've taken
Mm,
one small hiatus, which was recently at the tail end of 2024. I took about a 6-week break from the show, but we're back at it already. And honestly, that's the biggest win, is that despite the outcomes, right? Despite whether or not it has netted me dollars in the bank or
mm-hmm.
huge opportunities that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise, or people that I've been able to meet that I wouldn't have otherwise, the biggest win is for what I use to for what I get to talk about all the time, which is storytelling. I've really used it as a storytelling playground, and
Yeah.
it's been a really good excavation process for me. And to me, that I've really stuck with it. So I know we'll get more into the story, but I have a career of interviewing people. So interviewing people is really easy for me. And when I started the podcast, you have to make a decision. Okay, are you going to do only solo episodes? Are
Yeah.
you going to do only interview? Or are you going to do a hybrid of in between? Well, the easy button would have been for me to go, well, I'm only going to do interviews because I'm really good at that. And there was no way that I was going to do only solo episodes because that sounded dreadful to me. So I thought, okay, the real challenge then is to do a hybrid and really use those solo episodes as April pushing April, which I have done. And so that part I'm really proud of.
So let's go back to the beginning. You started in broadcasting. Was that always an aspiration for you growing up, that when you went to school, and this is something that you knew you wanted to get into?
It was. I fell in love with storytelling and people's stories and being curious about people. Probably just kind of born with a lot of that natural tendency, but fell in love with it as a kid just through my own practice of reading. Did a lot of reading and just got captivated by people's stories, both biographies and fiction stories. And when I went into college, discovered that there was such a thing as a journalism degree, and that would be a pathway that I could just make a living, talking to people and getting people's stories, which I thought, well, that's a no-brainer, that's a really good idea. It wasn't so much about I ended up being in television. It wasn't so much about being on TV. I was just really looking for a way to do something that I thought was interesting and that would keep my attention. And it turned out that I landed in television. That seemed like a kind of something they taught a lot of in the journalism department, is a pathway. And it was a pathway for me in the beginning, and that's where I landed in the beginning of my career, was as a television journalist working for a variety of CBS affiliates around the country, and learned a lot. I mean, talk about, man, the things that job taught me that I still use to this day is, we could do a whole podcast episode on that, but, just taught me how to like get people to trust me quickly, because, when you're going out and interviewing cops and lawyers and parents who maybe just lost their child, you have to get the interview, you have to get the story, and you have to do it very quickly because you're on a 5 o'clock deadline. And so I learned a lot about getting to the story and asking the questions that penetrate fast, but doing it in a way that allows people to trust you and allows you to let them in. And that has served me really well in the rest of my career. And but there were a lot of things about that I didn't like, and, ultimately didn't stay on that path, but continued to work in production, if you will, and really worked with brands and telling their stories, and was just still always in that storytelling vein. And so, yeah, I've always knew somehow I would do that just because I loved it so much as a kid and fell in love with it even more in school, and then have found jobs and careers and now businesses that have just allowed me to continue on that path. So I'm one of the weird people out there that actually got a degree and have stuck with it for 30 years, which is an anomaly for most people.
Yeah, definitely. So if you can think back to your early days, like growing up, was it that you just like loved reading, or that you were just captivated? We talk about storytelling, right? Like as an early
Yeah.
age, I remember I don't know if I'm dating myself now, the bookmobile. The little van would come to our school, and it would have like
Yeah.
all these other books that weren't in our normal library in grade school. And I remember going in there reading like Encyclopedia Brown and all these like
Oh,
cool.
yeah.
I just get captivated by those stories. I'm wondering what it was like for you.
Definitely was a big reader. My
Yeah.
mom was a reader. My sister was a reader. My grandmother was a reader. My grandmother had this library built in her house, like, they just homemade library, but it was like at this tiny little closet that they turned into kind of sort of a room, and it was a library. And it was my favorite room in her house, just to go in there and just sit around all those books. And then later, my mom simulated that. She kind of built my bed into some bookcases. And growing up, I literally slept at night with all of these, at that time was fiction, all these, like the, Laura Ingalls Wilder
Yeah.
and Edgar Allan Poe. And I loved poetry as a kid for whatever reason. I loved poetry. And, just different Little Women, and just, stories that I can remember reading, and series that I remembered being, like always getting the next book.
Yeah.
And so I think that had a big part to do with it for sure. The other dynamic is I'm the third child in the family. I'm the youngest, and my brother and sister are much older than me. So my sister is 7 years older and my brother is 10 years older.
Okay.
So it was almost like by the time I was coming up through the house, my siblings were high school and college. And so it was almost like I was being raised as an only child, even though I
Yeah.
had siblings.
Yeah.
And at that time, my parents were so tired, right? They were just like, oh, we're tired of raising kids. And so I was left. This is going to sound like I was being abandoned. I had a great childhood. I really did. But I mean, I was left alone a lot. Like they're like, oh, April, just entertain yourself, because we're not going to entertain you, which really taught me a lot of independence. It taught me to, figure things out on my
Oh
own, which I
yeah.
love. I love all of these things. But so a lot of it was just spent time in my room. And if I was just in my room, I would typically be reading or journaling. Journaling is another big piece of my chemical makeup, if you
Yeah.
will. Yeah.
When did the journaling start?
Early. I don't even remember when it started. I can't ever remember a time that I wasn't writing something in a book, in a journal. Yeah.
So
I have a memory of not writing.
yeah, it's interesting because I try to stay consistent, and I've been doing some free writing now in the morning, like 20
Mhm.
minutes. And I
Yeah.
find that that's been really powerful.
So
And
good.
sometimes the stuff that comes through, you're like, it's coming from someone else, or it's like my higher self or
Oh,
something
for
like that, because you can
sure.
sense the moment when it's your mind is relaxing and the
Yeah,
words are
your hand
changing.
just
And yeah,
writes.
but
Oh,
even the
for
words that you're
sure.
writing, it's like, I don't know if this is me writing this right now. And
Yeah,
just, it's fascinating process.
it
Yeah.
really is. The subconscious, the higher power,
Yeah.
God, whatever you're connected to. Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah.
It really is. It's like you just allow yourself to be a vessel in that moment. And it is like very therapeutic. I always find there's some good stuff there that I'm like, wow, I needed
Yeah.
to read that. Thank you for writing that because I needed to read it.
So you patting yourself
Yeah,
on the
it's really
back.
cool.
Thank you.
Uh-huh. Yeah, there's been times I go back in my journal because my experience is like a lot of times when I'm writing, I'm feeling some sort of emotion. Usually
Yeah.
that's how I process emotion. So whatever I'm feeling in that moment, it's coming out in my pen and onto the
Mm,
paper. I'm pretty tunnel vision in the moment. So what's beautiful is then like, okay, dump it, leave it alone, come back to it. And then I'll come back to my journal after, a period of time, several weeks or whatever. And then I'll kind of flip back through the pages and remind myself what I wrote about. And that's when I really see stuff. That's when I'm like, wow, okay, now some things make a lot more
yeah.
sense. Or, oh, now that I've come down from that emotion, I can see things a little bit differently. And I just have such appreciation for that process that, yeah, I can't imagine. I just can't imagine not doing it.
Yeah. I've been on a spiritual journey probably for 20 plus years, probably going on longer than that, 20 plus years. So I've gone down all the rabbit holes, and this idea of like, everything existing at the same time, past, present, future. So it's almost like you're giving your past self
Your
is giving your
future
future
self.
self a message. It's I
Yeah.
love when I think about things like that.
Have you read Julia Cameron's work by chance with all of the Artist Way?
I know the author. I don't know if I've read it. I think I've read
Highly
the, okay.
recommend it for you and the listeners because if you are a journaler or you're not, either way, like she's got some really, really
Mm,
good tools. And The Artist Way is a book, but it's really like a workshop in a book.
okay.
And she just kind of takes you through her methodology, which is all about free writing in the morning. She calls it morning pages.
Yeah, yeah, morning pages.
And
Yeah.
artist dates, taking yourself on an artist date, and it's really just a process, so it's been fun for me to dig into it because, like I said, I've been a lifelong journaler, but I love upskilling anytime I can, and then again, for a listener who is like, "Ooh, I've never really dug into journaling," again, she would be a great resource. That book is fabulous. I recommend it to any chance I get to people.
Yeah, we'll make sure we drop that into the show notes as well. So this idea of you being, somewhat on your own when you were a child, and because your siblings were much older, it sort of forced you to kind of be independent and find your own way. Is that a skill that you just sort of honed over time? It's like this self-starter, and I got to kind of figure things out myself. It seems like from the arc of your career, that's been like a through line for you.
Yeah, for sure has a been through line, and it's something I've paid attention to, in retrospect, looking back over my life, and I can see it very, very clearly. And it's part of what I really value in my life now. It's something that, that I love about myself. There's things that I'm really glad that I'm independent. I'm really glad that I value free thinking a lot. And I don't think free thinking is being encouraged or taught in schools. And so it's something that I feel like is a strength of mine. And I value it when I see it in other people. So a lot of that is stemmed from there. Another kind of juicy part of the story is when I was in eighth grade, my parents also made the decision. We grew up in a really small rural community in East Texas, and there weren't a lot of opportunities. And my parents were both well educated, they were entrepreneurs, but they lived there because, their parents were there, my grandparents were there. It was just one of those situations where they never really broke out of that town. They built businesses there, so they were pretty ingrained. And they also knew that the mindset of that community as a whole was pretty limiting. We weren't seeing people go and, create new jobs and
Yeah.
solve world problems and things like that.
Yeah.
So my mom knew, again, kind of like raising a second family with me is, I think, what she felt like. She had learned a lot of what she didn't like about raising my brother and sister. She's like, oh, if I had it to do over, I would do things differently. Well, I was the do over. And one of the things that she was just like, we got to get her out of this town. We got to get her out of this public school system. And so they sent me to a, pretty prestigious all girls high school, well, all girls school. It's really pre-K through 12th grade. But I
Okay.
went in eighth grade. And so I actually went, it was part boarding school, part day school, but they had a
Okay.
boarding department at the time. And so I went into the boarding department in eighth grade. And this was just a few hours away from where we grew up. It was in Dallas. And so, they were still kind of present. I moved away from home in eighth grade, essentially. And literally, I've never moved back. I mean, after 8th grade, I literally have been on my own. Now, I obviously had, people at the school. We had hall counselors. We had people in charge and overseeing us. But even with that, at that school, we were taught a lot about independence, free thinking. I mean, it was a lot. It was very advanced for women, and even in these days, it was the 1990s, and most women were not being encouraged to do a lot of
Mm,
things that we were encouraged to do. So it was really cool experience. It was life-changing experience. It was a demarcation line that I can see in my life where at the time, at 14 years old, I went to that school kicking and screaming. I was
yeah.
homesick. I did not want to leave. I didn't understand why my parents were doing this. I was a good kid that got good grades. Why are you sending me away? Like all of it. And man, where I sit now in my 50s and looking back, and I have a daughter who, she's 16 now, but when she turned 14, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the age that I did that. I can't
Yeah.
even imagine doing it now with my own daughter. It's so
Uh,
crazy. Of course, we live in a little bit different world, but it was life changing and it taught me so much. It exposed me to culture. It was the first time I grew up as a Christian. I am a Christian. And it was the first time I'd ever been around anyone of a different faith. I went to school
hmm
with, I was a high Jewish population. So
Yeah.
lots of Jewish people were at that school. I learned all about the Judaism, didn't know anything about it. Went to school with someone who was from India, met with school girls there from Mexico, from
Wow.
France. I mean, they were
That's great.
literally from all over the world. And it just was so eye-opening. And so
That's so
again,
great.
that little girl coming from that really small community, rural community, very kind of white America, to that in it just, like I said, it was very eye-opening and a big imprint on my life, but definitely led to more of the independence and the
Yeah.
free thinking skills that I have.
Yeah. I mean, that, a little bit of the same for me. My parents sent me to all boys Catholic high school. And coming out of grade school, you're just like, what? We
You're
got to
like,
wear a
"What?"
jacket, tie,
It's
like all
such a
the
difference. Yeah.
uniform. But I think there was a lot, probably in terms of like discipline and focus on learning, the fact that it was all boys too probably helped because I did get good
Yeah.
grades there. And I can only imagine what my life would have been like in a public
Right.
school. And then when I did go away to college for a couple of years. And that first year of college, sociology class, reading assigned the autobiography of Malcolm X, and just
Ugh,
your just mind is blown. So just
your
like
mind
these
is blown.
worlds of
Yeah.
just like, what's happening? Like, where is this happening? And so great that you had that experience. They had the wherewithal to give you that opportunity, and it's amazing.
My mom is amazing. My mom is, yeah, just someone that just, not everyone wins in the parent department. And I scored, especially with my mom. My dad was great, but like really, it was my mom who drove all of these big decisions. And she was just like, nah, I'm not having any of this, and she just would do things different. And she ruffled a lot of feathers back in those days. I can remember like literally being, I don't know, like I think it was in middle school and I rode the bus home
Yeah,
every day. And this is back when I was, in a small community. And my sister was in high school at the time and there was a dispute about some things that my sister was on the
yeah,
drill team, was kind of like a
yeah.
dance team. This is so crazy, but there was a weight limit, right? They would weigh
Oh
these
gosh.
girls every week. And if you were over the weight limit that some arbitrary person decided, whatever that was, then you couldn't perform at Friday night's
Oh my
football game.
gosh.
Well, my sister struggled with her weight her whole life. She was not morbidly
Yeah.
obese, but she just struggled. And she was dieting and taking diet pills and all kinds of stuff to try to make that weight requirement. And then she missed. And then she missed 2 weeks in a row and they kicked her off the drill team. Well, my
Mm,
mom was like, no, 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 we're not doing this. So she went and fought this at the school
wow.
board. And again, you got to think rural
Yeah.
Texas. We are talking cattle ranchers and, doctors, and they ruled the town. And so there were no women coming in and
Yeah.
complaining.
Yeah.
And my mom comes barreling into the school board meeting and is like, basically, this is bullshit. Like, you're not going to treat these girls like this. You're causing weight problem. I mean, anorexia and bulimia and all kinds
Yeah.
of other stuff. And the next day, I'm riding home on the bus and I go to get on the bus and the bus driver says, "I'm sorry, we don't stop at your house anymore."
Whoa.
So that was a big reason why my mom said, "And we are exiting stage left and we're
Wow.
getting out of this. We're not going to play these games." Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. It's crazy. So you also can probably start to hear
Yeah.
why I'm so passionate around a lot of the work that I do is around helping women. Like my
Yeah.
mom was like, we're not going to do this as women. We're going to do things differently. We're going to use our voices. We're going to speak up. And it has a lot to do with, what I believe storytelling can do for women
Mm.
today. So a lot of that is, again, it's all rooted in my own story.
Wow, what a powerful story. And it clearly can show like how the path was created for you by those
Mhm.
experiences and just the wherewithal for your mom to realize like that. And
No.
that's not gonna happen to my family. And in a way,
Yeah.
a blessing because it's like
It's a huge
they
blessing.
show their
They did
true
us a huge
colors.
favor,
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Like, okay, thank you. Now we
Yeah.
know. But I think a
Wow.
lot of women, even to this day, it would be hard, but back then, man, she really showed guts. She did, and she ruffled a lot of feathers, but I think secretly behind the scenes, a lot of women were cheering for her, like,
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah.
and maybe men too, but it just was definitely I look back on that. And again, I'm middle school. I don't really understand all the politics of everything in life yet, but I know
Yeah.
that I got kicked off the bus for no reason, and
Wow.
I do. I didn't do anything. So it's really fascinating to look back.
Yeah, just like the narrow-mindedness of like adults making decisions that affect like children in their most formative
Yeah,
years is so
right.
backwards thinking.
It's so backwards
Yeah,
thinking.
that's so crazy.
Yeah. So
Wow.
when I went from there, basically, that probably did happen in seventh grade. And then the very next year was when I went to the, private school in Dallas.
Yeah.
And it was like, you talk about a pendulum shift, like from over here to
Yeah.
way over here, where it was an all girls school. I mean, they were raising feminists, no doubt about it.
Yeah.
And they were like, women, you can be anything and do anything. You're going to go to the best schools. You're going to get the best jobs. You're going to be leaders of businesses. You're going to be leaders in this
Wow.
world. I mean, they were pumping it into us.
Wow.
It was the best experience ever. Like,
That's
I wish I
amazing.
could have that around me even to this day. I try to do it, but I mean, gosh, it was just
Yeah.
like, I'd never heard such things before in my life other than through my mom.
That's
And
amazing.
to be surrounded around it day in and day out was just so cool. Like, they
Well, I'm
never
glad you
brought
got
in men speakers. Like,
Oh,
they
okay.
only brought in women speakers. They
Yeah.
only brought in women doing these things because, I mean, we have plenty of examples of men doing great things. We had
Of
no
course. Yeah.
examples of women going and doing
Of
this stuff.
course.
So it was really
Yeah.
powerful.
Yeah, and I think it's just amazing to see that hopefully that's changing slowly.
Yeah.
There's signs of some of it regresses at times,
Yeah.
but it's almost like, just having that experience, it locks it in for you. And just, that there's like, you can be that example now. And I'm sure that in the work that you're doing now, you're sort of like following through on that, that experience that you received from your mother and just carrying that forward.
Yeah, it is, really important. I think a lot of times my clients probably don't realize what part of me they're getting because, oh, yeah, sure, I'll help you tell your story. Yeah, you want to write a book?
Yeah.
Great, let's do that. But then I get in there and I will find some of the cracks, and I
Mm,
come in, I'm like, no, you can do this, and
yeah.
I get really fired up about some of those things because I have seen like, the light at the end of the tunnel. I feel like I do believe it's there and
Yeah.
I've seen it, a lot of people champion for that. It's just sometimes it gets murky out in the real world and it's hard to remember those things. And so you have to have somebody in your voice, in your ear telling you these things when you forget it. And I forget it all the time too. I've had these experiences. There are times that I fall prey to just the negative thinking or, the forgetfulness of what's possible. So I have to have
Yeah.
those cheerleaders in my corner too.
So we'll get into the coaching, but talk a little bit about the experience you had working at the production companies after you
Mm,
left broadcasting.
yeah. It was such a squirrely path. I mean, when I left television news, I really didn't know what I was going to do. I had gotten married and we kind of both like tossed a bunch of resumes out into the world and agreed whoever got a job first, that's where we were going to go. And my husband got a job first and it took us across the country to the Carolinas. And I just up and quit my career essentially. And I think everyone, I was working at a CBS affiliate at the time. And I think everyone in my life, and I was what, maybe 28, thought I was crazy. Like, what are you doing? You've worked so hard to build this career. You have an upward trajectory happening and you kind of got an in now at the television station. But I already had seen like, this isn't the work that I want to do. It's hard. I'm like shoving a microphone in people's face and at the most awful times. And, a seed was planted like, these are not stories that I want to be responsible for sharing. you know? And so we left. We moved across the country, and I didn't have a plan B. I didn't know. And the truth of the matter is, I actually went to work for a Bath and Body Works. So if you
Mm.
can imagine being a news anchor and reporter at a CBS affiliate in, decent sized market, and you go, you're upstanding community member, you're getting
Yeah.
invited to things, you're like, you're this person. And then we
Yeah.
move across the country and have a complete identity crisis. And I'm
Wow.
just wasn't even really for work. I mean, we sure needed money, but it was like, I got to get out of the house. I got to figure some things out. And I literally just took a job part time at Bath Body Works. But I had an anonymity back over there because nobody knew who I
Yeah.
was moving to
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
brand new town. And it gave me just kind of a minute to think about it and figure it out, which was nice. And so it's kind of funny, like that's a squirrely line that our careers can take sometimes. And then eventually we lived really close to Charlotte, and Charlotte was a hotbed for production back in those days. It still is to some degree, but it really was back in these days. And so I went over to Charlotte and I just started pounding on doors and really just trying to meet people at production companies. And I hired an agent. I was doing auditioning. Again, a bunch of spaghetti at the wall just to try to figure out what could I do with the skills that I had. I knew I was used to being on camera. I could talk. And so I surely could find something in those arenas, and ended up kind of landing in front of a guy who ended up just becoming a really strong mentor of mine, who saw that I had talent and skill, but could clearly see I didn't know what to do with any of it. And he just started guiding me. And he was the one that really started helping me get landing jobs. And so I ended up at first being on camera talent for a few really fun things at HGTV, DIY,
Okay.
Food Network, and stuff like that, because he was really plugged in over there. And then eventually I got really bored with that because you're just a talking head and you weren't using your brain at all. And I was like, I want to be behind the camera because I have too many creative ideas. I'm too free spirited, and I'm a thinker. As I
Yeah.
just told, I'm independent, so I asked for guidance, like, how do I be a producer? How can I come behind the camera and start producing? I knew a lot from being in television, but and broadcasting, but I really just learned, how that side of the business works. And I had really strong mentors who were willing to give me experiences, and they were kind of helping me on the side as I was navigating. And that's where I landed for quite a few years, hopping around to working with different producers and different production companies that were creating content for cable television, essentially.
Mm.
And then eventually landed kind of another squirrely line is what just kind of ended up being landing in a space that I really enjoyed because I liked being in production and creating content that was creative. But I didn't like that it didn't always have a strong storytelling element. It was very formulaic television. So there was a formula that we had to, shoot things a certain way and plug things in a certain way. And again, it kind of got monotonous after a while. And I'm like, well, there's really not an opportunity for me to tell stories. So I ended up kind of landing and migrating over into the health and wellness world, because then I got to start telling stories of transformation. So people making drastic change in their health or their wealth, their wellness, all of those
Yeah.
things. And so I got to start telling stories of huge transformation, stories of success, stories of top leaders at companies and what they were doing. Success leads clues. So I started to get to do those interviews and start telling those stories, which was really for the 15 years, really before I started Light Beamers, what I do now. That's where I lived. I loved it.
Mm.
And it really, it kind of informed even what I get to do now, because I was like, that's really what I love, is getting to showcase people's transformations and what's possible, even when we've been dealt a hand that maybe is less than desirable.
Yeah.
It's just kind of like the idea that there is ability to change in all of us. It's just, what do we do
Mhm.
with it? And so those were really fun stories to tell. I loved it. It got some award-winning content out there during those days, and it was a lot of fun.
What's a memorable story from that experience?
Oh gosh, there's a lot. There was this one company that hired me to do some segments that they would do every year for their national conference, and it was hero stories. And they were just, picking people
Yeah.
from their company that was doing, like, maybe they weren't the top seller, maybe they weren't the top producer, but they were a good human, and they were doing some really cool stuff. And so I went on a string of those hero stories, and I would get to go and tell, those stories. And so one that I remember, there's several that I remember, but one that was really cool it was a guy here in Texas, and it was right after Hurricane Harvey had hit Houston. And this was, 2017, I guess, around. And Houston got really hit by Harvey. And he lived up in the Dallas area, but he and some buddies literally just immediately got into action, and they went down to Houston. They gathered up some boats, and they gathered up a bunch of supplies, like just kind of snapped their fingers and pooled their resources and their networks and just made, a really horrible situation a little bit easier with people. And they got in these boats and they went on a rescue mission. And that's really what it took back in those days when
Yeah.
Harvey hit, just like any of these big natural disasters. You can't wait for the fire department or the police to come rescue you. It's really citizens that get out there and help people. That's what he had done. He didn't even live in this community. They drove, and then Hurricane Harvey had also hit a big area in Louisiana. And after they worked in Houston, they rallied up another group, and they went to Louisiana and worked down there, and enjoyed his story so much. He was very humble. He wasn't doing it for the accolades. He was very surprised to get this attention from his company. And I guess that's what I remember most about his story was, yes, it was really cool and heroic what he did, but it's actually his humility that stood out to me the most. And I just loved him. I just thought, man, I'm so happy I got to do this interview with you today. It was really cool.
Yeah, it's so important, like these unsung heroes that don't get the spotlight,
Yeah.
And there's so much of this happening on a daily basis. And
Day-to-day basis. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wish we could do stories like that
Yeah.
every single day. Yeah, I do.
Very inspirational. So, you've got all this experience now in production. Talk to me about what's happening in your mind that's pulling you in this direction for what will eventually become Light Beamers.
Yes, there was a period.
Or in your heart.
Yeah, it was in my heart. And it was really cool, like how things just evolve. And I was doing great work. Clearly, I loved what I was doing. I was getting to do great work. In those days, I would have been what you called a freelancer. I was not working for anyone. I was working for myself. I was already an entrepreneur. I just didn't call myself one at that time. And, gigs would come in and gigs would go. And so there were times when I was working, times when I wasn't working. It was actually a perfect time because it was during the time that I was having kids and raising a family. So it's suitable to my lifestyle at the time. But I'm a creative at heart, right? I'm a producer. That's like what's in my heart. And so I got really agitated on the times when I didn't have work coming in, and I would just be restless and like, I'm ready for the next project. Where's it coming from? And part of it was like, a lot of what I'm doing, I just like, it kind of just feels like a paycheck sometimes, because it was pretty repetitious. It was a lot of the same kind of work. And I started kind of just saying, okay, well, I already really love what I do. My career is kind of like at an 8 or 9 level, but what would it look like to try to take my career to an 11, to go beyond a 10? And I did not know the answer to that question, but it was, again, my curiosity. It was just like, I wonder what else I could be doing.
What prompted that question for you?
I think just the restlessness. I was restless, and I just, I don't sit still well. I get bored really easily. And so anytime I'm bored, I'm like, oh man, I gotta be productive. That's how I'm wired. And I think it was just the restlessness of, and still, even like when I would get an assignment, it was still kind of dictated to like, this is what we need you to go do, right? Like we need this one story. And I'm like, again, I just know there's like these vast stories out there. So this was around the time also in kind of context of historical times was, we're all on social media now. Like this is 2014-ish. I'm on social media and I see how people are storytelling on social media. And I'm like, oh gosh, like that could be really improved, like that's not helpful, a lot of negative stuff, a lot of CNN stuff, right? And I just thought, man, if people only knew how to tell their story, there would be a lot of really this would be a lot more fun on social media if people actually knew how to tell their story. Something about those two things, those two thoughts in my brain happening at the same time, kind of curious, what else could I do with my career? How can I make it more productive and fun and more engaging and not like restless in the downtimes? And then coupled with paying attention to what I'm seeing in the marketplace. And again, I'm a faith-driven person, and I was in prayer about this at the time. I was literally in prayer about it a lot with, God, like, okay, I know I have talents, I know I have strengths, but I want to be used. I want them to be used in a positive way. And this is great, but do you have more for me? Like, what else do you want me to do? That's literally what it kind of sounded like.
Sometimes you have to be careful with those
You really
requests in
do,
terms of what you get.
because like then these ideas started coming and I'm
Yeah.
like, what? Like it did not make a lot of sense to me at the time. And I feel like you're up for this and your listeners are up for this. This just to me even just sounds a little cuckoo, but this is what happened. I started having this subconscious experience with the word light. And the only way I know how to describe it is once my consciousness caught up with the fact that this has actually been happening in my subconscious for a while, what had been happening was I would see the word light written on a page or on a book or whatever, and it would just be like everything on the page went away and disappeared except that
Wow.
one word light. Like it's like a cartoon, or sci-fi
Yeah.
movie. Like everything disappeared except this one word and we kind of jump off the page. Or I would be driving and I would hear in the car with no one with me, this like person's voice, light, light. And I'm like, what?
Wow.
So it was like it was in my subconscious, but it felt in my
Yeah.
reality. And it was
Yeah.
so weird. And again, I'm a big journaler. So I'd be journaling at night and I would just find myself again, how you talked about earlier, just sometimes you're just writing things and you don't even know why you're writing them.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
found,
Yeah.
and I still have this saved in my journal. I was just writing the word light over and over and over again because my subconscious was hearing it and thinking about it, and it was being delivered to me from the divine, right? I didn't tell anyone about this for like 4 months because I'm like, what is going on? Like, even my husband,
Yeah.
I
They'll
didn't
start
tell him.
referring you to a psychiatrist or
Yeah, I'm
something.
like, am I okay? But then I'm like, okay, what is this really about? What does light even mean? And so I was like, okay, light. Well, there's two definitions of light. One is like it's not heavy, easy to carry, like it's light. And I was like, yeah, I want that. Like, I don't want heavy things to carry. I want things to feel light. And then light being, something that illuminates the darkness, it illuminates the way. And again, I think that's what I was seeing on social media. Like, a lot of dark, it is still there, but like there's a lot of darkness. So, there's a lot of just junk out there and people just spreading stories that are not relevant or important or matter. And what if we could use those stories in a way that would illuminate the way for others? So all of this just kind of converged into my ideas coming forward of I could teach people how to share their story. I actually know a lot about storytelling. I've been doing it for quite a while now, and I know how to interview somebody and extract the story out of them. What if I taught them that? Like not everyone gets the luxury of having a video producer to show up at your house to interview you for the hero story that's going to play at the national conference. But yet there's so many of these great stories out there. What if we
For
like
sure.
taught people how to actually goes back to many things I've shared already in this interview, to use your voice, to stand up for what you believe in, to speak, to take up space, to take up room, share your story, document it as your existence. Because if you don't do it, no one's going to do it for you.
Exactly.
And that was really what came out of my thinking and my prayer and what God was handing to me and asking me to do. And that was light beamers. That's where I came up with light beamers. It's like, well, if we did that, we would be light beamers.
Mm.
We would carry a lighter load and we would illuminate the way for others. And that's what we're doing.
Wow. That's been
10 years.
10 years. So I'm sure that there's been so many transformational
Oh,
stories from
yeah.
the people you've been working with.
Oh, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I have the best job in the world. It's amazing to see the human spirit at work and to see it present and to see when people will let it be out into the world and showcase what they've done. It's incredible. It gets so life affirming and gives me full of hope every single day. On my bad days, which I have plenty of, right? We all have bad days. I just think about some of my clients or some of the women that I've met and just like, oh my gosh, if they got up that day and did that, I'm going to get out of my bad mood today and go do my thing.
Yeah.
It's really the coolest thing ever.
From all the women you've worked with and you've seen these transformations, when you think about the before and the after, where do people get in their own way, whether it's a self-limiting belief or
Mhm.
something that they think that it's not possible, and obviously from working with you, then they see what's possible. What's that common thread of the
Yeah.
people that, just are about to break through, but they don't know it?
Yeah, it's two different pieces. One is sort of their hang up around either this story is so big, I wouldn't even know where to begin because it's convoluted and it's messy. And it's like, some people are walking around with these really big stories and they're overwhelming. And it's like, well, how would I could go tell that story, but my gosh, there's so many pieces to it and it's big and it's complicated and it's messy. So there's that, they can get overwhelmed by that. And then you have other people, and this is kind of where I fell in my category when I looked at my own story, because I also had to figure out, like, oh, if I'm going to go build this business, I'm going to have to tell my story too, which was something we never did as a journalist, never put my story out there because that was not my job, which is interesting. When I looked at that, I'm like, I don't really have a story. Like, I'm kind of like just vanilla over here. I haven't, overcome some giant thing. I haven't had massive complications in my life. I'm just like a lot of other people, just going along, day by day and just navigating life as we do. And so you tend to think, well, then no one's going to be interested in that story. That's kind of boring. So that's one area where people get hung up, is they think, oh my gosh, it's so big, I don't know what to do it, or it's so boring, no one would care. And none of that is true, right? Like, there is a way to navigate both of those. The other piece that people get hung up on is the way I talk about storytelling, a really simple framework of, I call it the story arc, and this is not new information. I didn't invent storytelling. This has been around for, since the beginning of time, with the caveman days. They would document stories, which is really just like, if you like a fairy tale, there's the before, the once upon a time, the hero comes in and saves the girl and they live happily ever after. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so in the way that I think of it, there's a before, and that's usually some sort of struggle or pain or something that's happening. There's the transformation. Again, I, really always looking for the transformation, that something happens or something, you become aware of something to where your perspective starts to change and you see things differently. Maybe it's a big moment in your life. Maybe it's a car crash, something like that. Or maybe it's a season in life. Maybe it's going through a divorce. But something shifts and you start to see things differently. And then the other side of that is then, well, now what do you do? Like, now there's something that is different about you, or something now, you have knowledge, you have wisdom, that you do something differently. Where most people get hung up is they just get totally stuck in the before. Even though they've already been through a transformation and they have the knowledge and the wisdom, their mind and their heart, their emotions are still tied to the thing that was hard, right? And they don't even give themselves
identity.
Credit. They're all stuck there, and they're not even giving themselves credit for the thing that they've gone through and overcome. They're still stuck in the shame or the feelings of whatever it may be of, like, we just use a divorce. Someone went through a divorce. Well, he didn't love me enough anymore. Like, oh, I wasn't good enough. No, you survived divorce. You went on, you did all these amazing things, and you're still stuck in this emotion that's just no longer serving you. And it's certainly not going to serve anyone else. Of course, you don't want to go tell that story because you're looking at it all wrong.
Yeah.
So we just really need to help them see that there's so much more to their story than the point of impact, right? There's so much more beyond that. So I always tell people, you got to get to the ... Yes, that happened to you. And then what?
And then what?
And then what? Let's get to the ... There's more to the story. You're just hung up in a piece of your story that you can't see past.
That's lovely. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about where this idea for the podcast came up, because you obviously have your hands full, you're coaching. You started the coaching around the same time I started my agency, and a year after I started podcasting myself. And I thought I was late at the time.
Oh my gosh.
What was happening in your world, and why did you feel like that was like a next step for you?
Well, I mean, part of my own business, is looking for ways to increase my visibility. Just from a good marketing standpoint, we should be looking at ways that we could be getting our own voices out there. And, at the time I was just really, really relying on social media, and and that was great, but I knew there was more. I've come from a media background. I knew there was leverage that I was missing out on. So just from a strategic and knowledge standpoint, I'm like, yeah, podcasting makes a lot of sense. I should go do that. What I got hung up on was, because I come from this really highly professional background where the videos look amazingly good, because I have all this huge team that makes all of our videos look amazing. Now it's just me, right? I'm running this business by myself with like a VA in the Philippines, right? Like, it's just me. And I don't have a giant team. I don't have all the fancy editors. I don't have high def cameras. I couldn't think like how to make this podcast be like the ultra slick,
Yeah.
production that I was
Yeah.
used to. So for a long time, I didn't start because basically I was waiting for it to be perfect, right? And it
Sounds
just isn't.
familiar.
That's a
Yeah.
dumb. So very familiar, right? So yeah, so I was getting hung up there. But eventually, what made me decide to start it is like I knew it was a good idea. I knew it would be great for visibility. And I had not, I was still in my business and still am. This is a constant evolution of me is practicing telling my own story because as I said, as a journalist, we weren't telling our stories. We were telling everyone else's stories. So the vast majority of my career, and even when I started Light Beamers, I was focused on helping other people tell their story, figuring out how to do it for them. So I was still immersed in other people's stories. It was when I realized, oh, well, part of marketing is going to be you need to put yourself out there. People need to know your background. They need to know your stories. They need to know your
Mm,
vulnerabilities to humanize my own
yeah.
brand. And that was an extra. So I can really empathize with my clients because it was a really uncomfortable position. And even though I knew how to do it, it didn't make it any easier. So part of the podcast for me was in the name Inside Story was there's like this real inside story, the struggle of what we're going through when we're trying to do these things, when we're trying to launch brands, when we're trying to put ourselves out there, when we're writing books and stepping on stages and launching podcasts. It's requiring a lot internally from us that is just not easy. And, I just wanted to normalize that and be an illustration of that through my solo episodes being like, okay, guys, here we go again. I'm going to try and tell one of my stories now, and here goes. And I was digging out stories that were really uncomfortable, but I knew were relevant. And I needed to practice being a better storyteller if I was going to teach this to other people. And so I just kinda wanted to walk my talk, and I just finally landed on the fact that the podcast could be a really great kinda playground for
Mm,
me to do that. So that was ultimately what really actually got me to pull the trigger. I was like, "Okay, I need to do
yeah.
that for
Yeah.
myself," which is why I told you that's why it's the biggest win for
Sure.
me, like, I'm still doing it 4 years later. I didn't bag out. I didn't go, "Okay, enough. I told enough stories. I'm done." And we have interviews too, so, we mix it up, but that's really why I did it, and that's what the name kinda signifies,
What's been the biggest challenge with the show?
keeping it going week after week
Yeah.
after week. I have a great team. I have, hired an editor, and my VA helps so much, like, the production side of it, I feel like we have dialed
Good.
in, and we got a good system, and we have a great system,
Yeah.
actually, and so that it really does free me up to be the creative
Hmm.
person and be the one that's driving the content. But at the end of the day, there are days that it's like, just keeping that going week after week and coming and making time to sit down and record. It's just kind of the minutia of it sometimes is the hard
Yeah.
part. It's not really coming up with ideas, but it's just there is a lot of other stuff going on. And yeah, it's just I guess that's it. It's just the minutia. But the reason why I do keep going is because I just try to stay tied to the why. Are we doing
Yeah.
this? And then also podcasting is just kind of a lonely world because, we love reviews, but people don't seem to love giving
Yeah,
them
for
because
sure.
it's time consuming and they forget and it's just not top of mind. That's not their
Yeah.
priority. But gosh, man, like sometimes just going and reading a new review, it's like, okay, all right, I can do this again. I'll get going again this next week. It's really
Yeah.
helpful. But when you don't have that and you're just in front of a microphone by yourself and that's why I appreciate conversations with other podcasters because I always hear the same thing. They're
Yeah.
saying the same thing. It's like such a lonely world. And so those have been some of the hard things about podcasting.
Yeah. I think when people encounter podcasters, they think they're naturally like extroverted. And like from going to podcast conferences, it's so funny because most people are like, I call them myself situationally extroverted. So I'll go to the conference,
Yeah.
I'll be like hanging out, talking to everyone because I see some of my old friends there. And it can definitely start up conversations. And then the podcaster in me gets naturally curious and all that stuff. But then once I'm
Yeah.
home, it's just, it's just like wind
Yeah.
down. And just like, it just takes
Totally.
a lot out of me. And so it's not and some people are
Yeah.
like naturally outgoing and they just keep it on all the time. But I definitely agree with you. Like, it's something that I don't think I'll ever give up because I would miss it. Like
You
I
would
would
miss it.
miss,
Me too.
just I'd look forward to these conversations and it's not like this huge show or this big money owner, but it just keeps like we talked about earlier, just, keeps the iron sharpened and,
It
and it keeps
does.
me just engaged. And it helps me with my clients and my students just kind of, oh, I just learned this from this interview. I just kind of picked up this
Yeah.
tip, and even just ideas on how to market the show and exploring like the new world of YouTube and how to, get visibility there. And so there's always something to
Well,
tweak and play with the show. And
yeah.
I think it's always like an ongoing project for me.
And I'm sure you've seen this too, because how long have you had this show? It's been a while.
2014. Yeah, 11
Yeah, so
years. Yeah.
over 10 years now, right?
Yeah.
That's big show. My experience, and I'd be curious if this has been yours too, like, even though we have, like, seasons, right? But I'm like, "Man, the show really has had its own identity over the
Yeah.
years, and they have shifted, from year to year." And even the season that I think I'm in now and where I'm at with my show coming off that hiatus that I took at the end of the year, which I'd never done. I was so determined to not have pod fade, as they call it. I was like, "Nope, that's
Yeah.
not gonna be me." And I was kinda nervous about even taking a hiatus, but when I came back, I was like, "Oh, like, I'm so ready to talk again," and I'm ready to put my ideas out there, and I feel like I'm even in a new season in this podcast now where I feel like it's had its own kind of voice. This season, it's like I really, 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 really want it to be the voice of storytelling, and I haven't always said that on the podcast, even though I work in the world of storytelling, and storytelling is so important to me and what I wanna talk about in the world, but I don't feel like the podcast, even though it's called The Inside Story, I feel like it's taken me 4 years to literally get here to where I'm like, "Oh, this is the season that we are all about storytelling," which might just sound so hysterical, and it kinda does, but I feel like we're just getting our stride on? So it's really interesting how I can look back and see that.
Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah. Because sometimes you can't see the progress if you're just kind of looking back day to day, and you
Yeah,
just have to like take the time and see where the arc of your journey has taken you with regard to the show. And you
yeah.
start to looking back at the conversations over the years. How have you grown or improved or evolved as a host or as a storyteller with your own podcast since you started?
As a host, I feel like I've grown because that's been maybe a more challenging one to figure out how to grow there because I guess a couple of years ago, I sat down and I'm like, how many people do I think I've interviewed in my career? I haven't documented every interview that I've done, but I had a pretty good idea from the number of years that I've done certain things and what those days look like. And now what I've done at Light Beamers, I've quantifiably figured out that I've probably interviewed 10,000 people in my career, which is pretty significant. Yeah.
Wow.
And
Wow.
when I saw that, when I really, because I was like, I'm not going to say that number unless I really think I can back that up. And I'm like, yeah, I really think I can back that up? So when I saw that on paper, like when I did the math and was like, wow, that's a lot? And so I think the podcast has had its own like tweak to my improvement there. But I would really say that over the course of the 30 years that I've been doing this and I've had those 10,000-ish interviews, I feel like I really know that I'm able to ask the better questions, the
Yeah.
harder questions.
Yeah.
I'm not interested in fluff, and I will go quicker to things that I really want the person talking about. And so I've gotten, I guess, just sharper in the way that I'm able to do that. I think I've been just how it's helped me and it has always helped me. It just increases my compassion for people. Like I've heard
Mm.
people
Yeah.
sometimes sit down and start to tell me their story. And they're like, okay, like, you probably never heard this before. And I'm like, I probably have actually.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
okay. I don't come from a place of judgment. I'm really here to hear you and listen. I want to be your audience. And so really learning to do that has helped so much. Just really learning. I think early days of my career, I was always thinking about my next question, and I know a lot of
Yeah.
podcasters think that, like,
Oh,
what's my
yeah.
next question going to be? I never write down questions anymore, ever. I'm much more in tune and present with people. I'm much more compassionate and I actually hear their story so that I can also hear what they're not saying and be able to ask the question and I've just let go of what is it supposed to look like and what am I supposed to get out of them? What's the end result of the story that I've been hired to
Hmm.
get, right? I just have all that has gone away. And so that's the freedom that I have in my career now is that I don't have someone paying me to do a story a certain way. And that
Yeah.
it's allowed me to really just be present with people and ask questions and let the interview go where it goes. Kind of like how your style is very much that way too, which is why I appreciate it.
Yeah, I just really enjoyed kind of going with the flow, and I
Yeah.
can't believe an hour's gone by.
I know
Well,
that's one of
just a
the
couple more
fun
questions to
parts.
wrap up, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, is there like something, I don't want to call it a tip or a tool or a tactic, but how do you get people to open up quickly? Was this something that you learned, or is this something that you kind of like a little tip for podcasters just getting started, especially with interview-based shows?
Yeah, this is something that I have really had to learn, right? I told you back in the early days, I had to figure out how to do things quickly. And honestly, it's such a basic thing. But the simple thing of just smiling at people, like when you enter a room or you show up for the interview, be there, be 100% there. Don't like check yourself in the car before you get out of the car or before you open up your Zoom or Squadcast or whatever. Like, be on, be ready, be there. I've just learned that this carries over in my life too now. This is kind of a cool side effect, but I learned when I was going into that house or I was going into that police station or wherever I was going in, like when I got there, I had to be ready. And I had to show that I was
Mm,
open, that I was friendly, that I was here to listen to both sides of the story, that I was not a place of judgment. I had to, like, emit that energetically because I didn't necessarily have the words or get the opportunity to say those words. So you have to just literally beam energy from yourself, telling people with your heart, this is heart math, this is real science, heart
yeah.
math that says, "I am a safe place. I'm here to listen to you. I am not judging you, and I want to hear your story." And that takes some practice. You need to practice that, but look up heart math. It's a real thing. You literally can use your heart to enter the room first with your heart and enter the room with that mentality. Give yourself that pep talk before you show up and say, okay, I'm here for them. I always say the number one rule of storytelling is who is your audience? Remember that first. Who
Yeah.
are you talking to? Who are you trying to reach? Who are you
Mm,
trying to get, right? It's about them first. It's not about your agenda, your outcomes, your beautiful interview.
mm.
It's about their story and them. So, like, you got to come in the room with that. And that starts in your
Oof,
heart.
that's powerful. I got the
It's true,
chills.
though. Like, don't ask me how I figured that out. I mean, again,
Yeah.
25 years old and hitting the streets. I made a lot of mistakes for sure. But again, I think it was just the divine showing me that there are ways to do this and to do it well. And I'm going to outfit you with the skills that you need to be able to go down this path because I'm going to use you here. Right. So now I get to share that with someone else who may not be a journalist by trade or do a
Yeah.
lot of interviews like I do. So if you can use that and you can practice that, it's a ninja tip that's going to change the way you even go into
Sure,
networking
sure.
meetings or go to those podcast shows and you're overwhelmed by all the people.
I love how you
Yeah.
brought it back full circle to the beaming of the light and the light beamers, and it just kind of tied it all together. So I don't know if that was intentional, but that was
Yeah. I
beautiful.
would.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much
It
for that,
was kind
April.
of fun.
So, last two questions I ask all my guests. What is something you've changed your mind about recently?
That's a good question. Yeah, there's been some big decisions that I've made in my business that I've changed my mind on. Like at one time we would do things a certain way, and now I'm like, yeah, we're not gonna do that anymore. Just changed my
That-
mind. I don't want to do it.
Yeah, always have an open mind in terms of like, I think about that saying, what got you here won't get you there.
I've been thinking a lot about
Yeah.
that as well, that exact statement, because Light Beamers turned 10
Yeah.
this year in 2025. And I have been thinking about that. I'm like, what got me here the last 10 years is not going to be what's
That's
gonna get
true.
me to the
Yeah.
next 10
Same.
years. I have to evolve, I have to change, I have to be, available for new ideas and new ways of being, and so that's where some of those decisions have
Mm,
come from, like, "Oh, okay,
yeah.
we're not doing that anymore.
Yeah.
We've done that, and we can put that to bed, and now we get to try something new."
Evolving,
Mhm.
growing, shedding skin. Yeah.
Yeah, evolving and growing. And that goes back to my nature of, like, getting bored quickly,
Yeah.
So, like, yeah, we're not gonna do that anymore. So,
What is the most misunderstood thing about you?
I think I come across as, like, really sweet and open and joy-filled and light and, positive Pollyanna, and I do like those parts of me. I think people are actually surprised about how kinda, like,
Mm,
sharp-tongued I can be, like, with my clients and with people in my inner circle. I will
yeah.
speak freely, and I will say things that you
Mm,
actually need to hear, or I think you need to hear, and I'm not gonna sugarcoat things. I'm a very direct person. And so I will do that in a way with love and kindness, but I also am not going to stand I just feel like I'm the person that's not going to stand for your
Mm,
mediocrity. And so, like, if you're playing small, I'm
that's
going to call
great.
you out on it, And I think that's surprising to people when they start getting that from me, because that's maybe not part of my
Sure, sure,
marketing,
sure.
you know? So they get inside, they're like, wow, you're kind of like a crazy woman. I'm like, yeah, but you
Yeah.
need to hear it.
That's
So,
wonderful because, if you think about them, the reason they came to you is because they're stuck and they've been probably in the repetitive pattern. And like they need that tough love medicine to just kind of like, and then I'm sure for some of them, you could probably see the reaction in their face. It's like a wake up call, like, oh, you told me what I've been like probably believing in my heart all this time, and you calling me out on it, and it's uncomfortable, and I don't want to hear it, which means I need it to hear.
yeah,
Yeah,
it does. I mean, and I know I appreciate that when people
yes,
do it for me,
same.
because like I said, gosh, I get stuck in my own ways and I have moments where I'm totally playing small. And I so appreciate the strong voices in my life who are be like, April, come on, no way, you're not
Yeah,
going to
yeah.
do that. And I'm like,
It's important to have a circle
so
of, people that'll call you
yeah,
out. When I got started
that will,
leaving my corporate
yeah,
job and I was getting into digital marketing and entrepreneurial space that was brand new, that Jim Rohn quote, man, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And I was like, I
mm,
got to change my circle because I need to be uncomfortable for a bit.
it
Yeah.
is so true. That who you surround yourself with is so key.
Well, I'm glad I surrounded myself with your energy in this conversation. And
Oh,
I just
likewise.
never know where these are going to go, but I'm feeling into them lately and just feeling like, oh,
Mhm.
I'm getting good vibes just from our like small interaction. And I saw your website. I mean, I'm like, oh, light beamers. Okay, this is going to be good. And then to seeing the work that you're doing. Obviously I felt like that feeling I had was the right one because this has been just a beautiful, like, just open, heartwarming conversation for me and just the type of conversations I want to have. Like I want to look every time on the calendar when I have these booked and be excited that I'm about
Yeah.
to have a conversation on the show. And, everything you share just sort of validates that I feel like I'm on the right path when these happen
No.
because I'm just glad we found each other and I get to tell your story and share your story with my audience as well. So thank you so much for everything you were open enough to share. And I know that your words are going to inspire people. So I appreciate you.
Well, thank you, Harry. I think it's really cool, the story of how we did connect. It seemed random at the time, but I know it wasn't random at all. And
Yeah.
we were supposed to be here today. And I just really, really appreciate the opportunity to share me with your audience and to share, nothing else, to maybe just get them inspired about their own story. And that would be a win in my book. So,
Yeah, I'm sure that's going to happen. So, where's the best place for folks to connect with you in the show and figure out ways to work with you as well?
well, I'm definitely going to say LinkedIn for sure,
Yeah, we have to.
right? Come on.
Yeah, find me on LinkedIn. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
find me on LinkedIn. Light Beamers, really everywhere. We use Light Beamers handle on all
Okay.
the platforms, but the main ones that we are on, I'm not a TikToker. So I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn.
Okay.
And lightbeamers.com is my website. And yeah, I would love to hear from anyone that wants to reach out. I'd love to chat.
Yeah, and you provided us all those contact details, so we'll make sure everything is in the show notes, so no one gets to get worried about like listening and taking down notes and stuff. So, thanks again, April. Really, again, really enjoyed our beautiful conversation. I appreciate you coming on.
Me too, Harry. Thanks.